Okay, biology kids, we just finished our unit on evolution, and we need to get started on a new unit here over ecology. This first chapter in this unit is on principles of ecology. This first section is on the relationships that those ecologists study. So your objectives for this section are to summarize the levels of organization that ecologists study, and then also to describe research methods ecologists use to study the environment. So first off, ecology is the study of interactions among living things and between living things and their surroundings. So all we're talking about again are relationships. How do living things interact with each other, but also how do those living things interact with their surroundings? That's what ecology is in a nutshell. So we have to start out with some levels of organization. You have kind of a template in your notes already. But we're going to start out with an organism. Remember, that's an individual living thing. And a group of organisms, right? A group of the same kind of living thing that live together would be a population. But then there's the next step up where you have more than one different kind of living things that all interact together in a community. So the difference between population and community is actually kind of important. Remember, a population, you just have one species. In a community, you have multiple species that are interacting together. But then your next step up from community is going to be an ecosystem. Which means that not only do you have multiple species that are interacting with each other, but they're also interacting with non-living things, right, that would also be really important to them, like, say, water, sunlight, oxygen in the air, right? So all of those things that come together, that's what makes an ecosystem at that point. And then we do have one more step up where you would have a biome, right? A biome is basically a collection of ecosystems all over the globe that are similar to each other. Right? There'd be similar climates, there'd be similar living things in those areas, right? But biome's just that next step up, just collective on a global scale. All these similar ecosystems would be grouped together. So again, you start at the individual organism, right? A group of organisms that are the same species are a population. Different species grouped together and interact with each other in a community. Then you have non-living things that come into the mix for ecosystems, and then that next step up is a biome, a collection of ecosystems globally. Okay, so actual definitions for those things necessary in here. A community is a group of different species that live in a given area. We already had population and organism a long time ago, so technically we're not having definitions for those here. But that community, again, is you got a different species. The ecosystem is where you bring in those non-living factors as well as the living factors in an area, all the organisms that live in that area. Right? Remember, a biome is going to be a major regional or global community defined by the conditions and major types of plant life that live there. So we'll go through some biomes as we get farther into this chapter. But basically, when you think about biomes, right, you can have grasslands, you can have forests, you can have even a desert that lacks plant lives. But a lot of those things are pretty obvious when you talk about them, understanding what might be found there. So plant life is a really big thing. Otherwise, it's also defined by its climate, because a desert has very little rainfall, whereas a tropical rainforest has lots of rain, since it's in the name, but it's also a forest of trees It's not just grasslands, so it's different than grasslands. Otherwise, the last little bit of this section is talking about research methods. Basically, just have some major points here for the three sections that are in this section of this chapter. The big one here, most of what we do in ecology, most of what can be done in ecology is you basically just gather lots and lots and lots of data through observations. Sometimes it's kind of hard to pick out patterns because nature is kind of unpredictable. In most sciences, it would be ideal if we could do an experiment, but in an experiment, you have to control variables. And that's actually kind of impossible in nature. You know you can't control things in nature. So since we can't really control our variables, we can't really do experiments when it's all said and done. At least not the way that we would like to. What scientists will do instead is they will use models. And basically that means you have tons and tons of data that we talked about before that you gathered through observations. And then you throw them into a computer, and that's when you start to try and predict how those different variables affect one another. You might not be able to control variables in an experiment in a specific place and time, but if you take different places that have similar things in them, similar living things in them, you can compare how one is different from another. Maybe there's more rainfall in one place than the other, and you could understand how that might affect the living things. So if you try to collect a bunch of data and then you start comparing different places, you can start to eliminate variables as far as knowing exactly what caused whatever it is you're trying to figure out. So you can use tons and tons and tons of data, but again, it takes tons and tons and tons of data, and you have to have lots of different places that are similar so that you can work with it. So it's tough to do, but it's the best thing that we can do. And ultimately, you just need to gather tons and tons of data and see what you can see out of it. You can't really do an experiment, which makes it tough from a scientific perspective, but you do what you can do. All right, so that's this section.